the scientific consensus is that if meat were to stay even, climate goals would be impossible. But it's not going to stay even, it's going to go up.
Any approach on the climate that took, by any administration, that took a behaviorist note or behaviorist approach failed. Carter was the worst one. Carter was sitting in the White House, heating turned down, with a big coat, and of course didn't get re-elected because nobody liked the story.
I don't want to sound like a conservative conspiracy theorist, but
climate philanthropy in a new political landscape, or saving what can still be saved. I think the framing was already pretty clear that we all have the feeling that the situation is getting worse in terms of politics, in terms of social perception, public perception, and I'm really happy to be talking about this tonight because I think a lot of this framing can be challenged. And my name is Clara. I work as a journalist. I focus on climate and energy and whatever is happening in the capital, Berlin. And I'm very honored to be guiding you through this evening. And as I said, also very happy because I think I am being challenged a lot with the whole narrative of climate change now being unchallenged and that nobody cares about it anymore. And I have the privilege to be talking to people who care about it a lot all the time. So I think it's good to take that out and to make sure that there's actually a lot to gain. And I think you just said, Sebastian, that there's also a lot of opportunity in this new government. So I'm really looking forward to be discussing this with our three guests. And you said that they are the most important voices in what can be done about climate change at the moment. So I'm really happy to introduce Johannes Agwa. He leads the climate team at Founders Pledge, advising donors and entrepreneurs on how to give with impact. And I think it's really interesting to talk to you because you also focus on designing strategies, climate strategies that can resonate not just with progressives, but also with the political center and right. And then we have Bruce Friedrich, who we are really happy that he is here with us in Berlin today. He's the founder and CEO of the Good Food Institute, a key voice in transforming our food system, as we all know, one of the biggest challenges in terms of climate change. And he does that not by demanding abstinence, but by scaling alternatives to meat. And I think that will resonate very well with our new minister for nutrition in Germany, who's really in favor of Wurst. And then we have Peter Schniering. He's the founder of the Future Cleantech Architects, works on breakthrough technologies for hard-to-abate sectors like steel and cement. And I know that his mission is to bridge the gap between philanthropy, industry, innovation, and impact. Welcome, everybody. Another round of applause, please. I want to begin with the big picture. We've said it, there is a significant political shift, not just in the US and Europe, but also beyond that. And Bruce, because you've traveled the furthest, let's start with you. What has changed in your work in the past year due to that political shift? Is there any concrete things that you can talk about?
Things have, because the idea of making meat in a new and better way, so just to sort of level set, what we work on is not alternatives to meat, just like an electric car is not an alternative to a car, and solar and wind energy are not alternatives to energy. An electric car is an alternative car, and wind and solar and nuclear are alternative ways of producing energy. So we analogize to renewable energy and electric vehicles in that we're not focused on plant-based meat that requires that people like something they don't like. We're literally focused on the science of perfectly biomimicking the meat experience with plants so that the two products are indistinguishable. But because the plant-based product is more efficient, it can actually cost less. So you sit down, you have two options. To you, they're identical. The plant-based product costs less and is healthier. And then the other thing we're working on is cultivated meat, which is basically just like you can take a seed or a cutting from a plant, bathe it in nutrients and grow a plant. You can take a small amount literally a sesame seed size amount of meat from an animal and grow actual animal meat. And it causes a fraction of the climate change. It requires a fraction of the amount of land. It doesn't require antibiotics. It doesn't contribute to pandemic risk, et cetera. So it's all these benefits. And it's just a new and better way of producing meat that's based in innovation. And so because this concept is relatively new, the focus has been alternatives to meat. The focus has been, let's convince you to eat something different and try to convince you that you don't love meat as much as you do.
Very successfully.
Yeah, I mean, it works to some degree, right? It's a lot easier to be vegan now than it was 10 years ago. But it's not easy to figure out how it scales. And we are now eating 370 million metric tons of meat globally. That's up 40% since the UN released, the FAO released Livestock's Long Shadow, where they said that animal agriculture is one of the top 3 contributors to literally every major environmental problem, including climate change, biodiversity loss, deforestation, et cetera. And since they released that report, that was 104 million metric tons fewer meat produced when they said what we're doing is a catastrophe. And that hasn't led to, meat production is up 40%. And all predictions are that every year it will hit a new record. It's hit a new record every year going back, other than a blip from COVID, but you can't even see the COVID blip now. It looks like there wasn't a blip, or the recession in 2009, but it just keeps doing that. So we need to do what renewable energy and electric vehicles have done. We know that the world's going to consume more energy. We know the world is going to drive more miles, and we know the world is going to eat more meat. We should certainly have more energy efficient everything, light bulbs to buildings. We should have more walkable cities. We should have bike lanes. We should do all of it. And yes, absolutely, let's educate people about the harms of the meat industry. Let's encourage people to eat less meat or go vegetarian. But we're not going to solve the problem with that. We need alternative meats, alternative proteins. That's what we're focused on. But as Johannes points out in the Founders Pledge report that he co-authored, it was pretty challenging to advocate for climate policy even under previous administrations. In the US, there are 2 parties. So GFI does go in with a focus on food security, food self-sufficiency, and economic competitiveness, which is to say this is innovation, it's more efficient, it can be more profitable. We have meat industry allies, and that allows it to be bipartisan. So consistently, every place we operate, and we have 6 GFIs, including in the US, the resonance of the message continues to improve, including in conservative administrations, including in the US. There are really positive things happening with the new administration, their regulatory stature. They have, in the first 150 days, the Trump administration has approved 2 cultivated meat companies to sell in the United States. That's exactly how many the Biden administration approved over 4 years. It was the previous Trump administration that really laid the groundwork for approvals at all. There is less openness to spend money on kind of anything. So that makes the scientific funding ecosystem challenging. But they're excited about biotechnology. They're excited about biosciences. They're excited about agriculture. So we have a lot to work with.
And you don't really see a difference when it comes to the political shift?
Outside of the United States, no. China is becoming more enthusiastic about alternative proteins. India, Israel, Brazil, Singapore, Japan, Korea, the UK, Germany, Spain, at the EC level in Europe. These are all the places that GFI has staff on the ground. Our number one goal is scientific ecosystem building. So our number one goal is making it so that the veggie burgers actually are indistinguishable and cost competitive, and scaling up cultivated meat, like figuring out how to do that, which is mostly a cost challenge, which has a lot to do with moving from sort of pharma ingredients in manufacturing to food ingredients in manufacturing. So that's a scientific challenge, and that's our focus. The way we think you do that is you convince governments to fund this work. Governments care a lot about food security. They care a lot about food self-sufficiency. They care about economic competitiveness. They want innovative ecosystems. All of that stuff is getting better and easier as the concepts become more socialized. We certainly have a lot more, even in the US, a lot more Republican advocates. And because this is a biotechnology play, and in the US, there was a 2-year bipartisan commission on biotechnology with 2 Republicans and 2 Democrats, Indiana senator, and an Oklahoma member of Congress, and then 2 California, 1 senator, 1 representative. And they include alternative proteins in what they're enthusiastic about. So we're super optimistic everywhere, including in the US.
I love that we falsified the whole thesis of this session in the first answer. That's amazing to hear. And I'll pass it on to Peter because I know that I've said it, you work on these hard to abate sectors and you have a very innovative and industry-friendly approach that is also not known to be specifically left or prone to just resonate with progressives. But there has been a big change on the EU level, which is where you work a lot too, on a level in Berlin, 100%. How does the change in narratives affect your work?
Thank you. We always try to distinguish rhetoric from actual action on the ground, so that we were able to feel a clear change in tone ever since the European elections last year. And I have to say that we host and speak at quite a number of events every month. And ever since the election results from Europe came up, there was this, we heard these undertones, because people sometimes put us into this green activist pocket.
Because there's only one box. And
there's only one box. So we heard these sort of punchy undertones sometimes. So now we're coming back big time. And it felt like there's almost a sense of revenge sometimes in the air. Not by a specific party or by a specific side of the aisle, but rather like the general audience. In the general audiences, sometimes you could feel, sometimes with small entrepreneurs, sometimes with people who are active maybe in local or regional politics, that they say, we've been prescribed this climate action thing for too long, and maybe that was this general perception that politicians, policymakers were pushing it a little too hard for too long. And so we could start it, there was a first change there, and then obviously, we keep hearing it everywhere we go. There's references to the US all the time. There's references to how will the German government react. But on the ground, in the type of work we do, maybe a sentence on that, our mission is to close the innovation gaps in the hard-to-abate sectors, so to drive innovation as hard as possible, to hope for spillover effects also outside Europe, where the biggest future emissions will be. There's, behind the rhetoric, there's a lot of pragmatism. And of course, it helps us that we've never been perceived as activists, or that because we're a technology think tank, we're pretty much non-partisan probably, and always try to keep that stance and never took sides with anyone, but just try to push good ideas. I have to say we see a couple of encouraging developments in Europe right now, also as a reaction to the US, perceived US developments, while also, Johannes might come to that, the picture is not that clear there as well. There's also some positive developments, particularly in your field, Bruce, but also in the clean tech space. So clear change in rhetoric, clear change in sentiment, but on the ground also some positive things happening.
And a lot of what you do is also about educating policymakers. You explain to them how these innovations work. Is there any change in interest in terms of are there less people who want to hear about it?
No, actually, I would even say it's an increase because it's more, I think it helps us, maybe some of you have come across our work already. One of the things we do is, in addition to reports we write or research consortia we do these fact sheets. So we summarize the very difficult energy world of the future in a simple yet precise way. We try to follow certain principles there, but boil it down so policymakers can understand it in an easier way. And ever since, anybody who wanted to push something on climate and climate action has to reframe it in terms of economic competitiveness, energy security, all these kinds of topics. There's a stronger sense of, okay, let's get down to what's the backbone of this whole, what are we talking about in the debate? How expensive are sustainable aviation fuels going to be? How about electrolysis? Is this ever going to work? You can see the new pragmatism in the steel industry. We just got a larger project in the steel industry. Suddenly everybody's saying, okay, it's nice we get these funding grants from the European or German level or wherever, but we're never going to get the hydrogen cheap enough to make it work that route. So there's even, but that's our special field. There's a stronger interest in the education part.
And you gave me a couple of perfect keywords to pass it over to Johannes. I think when I hear the two of you, it sounds like everything's great and things are going to move in the right direction and there's no problem, basically. I think we all know there is, so it is good to hear that perspective. But I mean, you've mentioned it. There's this feeling of climate having been over-prioritized. That is basically the framing that our current Minister of Economics has used. She said we need to deprioritize it a little bit. How can we resonate with that when it comes to climate action that can work in these times? I know that is essentially the work that you do, and Peter has mentioned there's a change in rhetoric, but it doesn't have to mean that there's a change in action.
Yeah. So I think the first thing to realize is that things that are good for climate and high salience of climate in the public discourse are not strongly connected. So if we think about the most important things that have happened that have actually reduced emission projections quite a lot over the last 20 years, it's like Germany investing in solar, not for climate reasons, but for we like renewables and we don't like nuclear reasons, or similar innovations, right? So similarly with electric cars or Denmark and wind. So it's actually not true that the public perception on climate is kind of a really strong indicator of progress on climate. But obviously it is true, right, that societal funding or the willingness to kind of do societal funding really matters and is really under threat right now. And I think we kind of see this most clearly in the United States, where right now, as we speak, the battle for the Inflation Reduction Act, the most important climate legislation ever, is kind of ongoing. So as the battle for keeping the Department of Energy in the United States kind of a functioning institution, which is, again, the most important driver of energy innovation in the world. So those are the battles that are being fought right now, and that will be quite decisive, and that have really changed the work that I do, certainly.
So what do you do looking forward in preparation to this talk? I've seen loads of articles from the US. There was a TED Talk about a conservative who basically had to defend herself, saying, I'm a conservative, but I do care about the climate. And a lot of Republicans seem to feel like climate policy is more of a Trojan horse to get in social politics and left-wing politics. And how do we find a way around that? What strategies do you suggest?
Yes, and I think, right, that suspicion is basically correct, right? I think as Peter already pointed out, right? So climate has been so heavily associated with left of center causes. I think everyone can think about this. If they know someone who cares a lot about climate change, you probably know 10 other things that this person is likely to believe, right? So that is kind of an indicator of something that's kind of very heavily politicized. And this is really where, this is where we're talking about climate philanthropy, where climate philanthropy can play a role, because ultimately public conversation, public discourse is to a very large degree a result of civil society organizations, both think tanks and more public movement. And I think Sebastian already mentioned, so in the US, climate organizations left of center have been funded at like 30 times than organizations working on the right. So that has kind of, when in 2023 we kind of observed, okay, now Biden has really passed major climate policy, but we're having a 50-50 chance at a Republican president quite hostile to climate action. So this is when we really went big on investing and growing this ecosystem, but we were very alone because most climate philanthropists are coming out of the environmental movement, have have very typical environmentalist progressive beliefs, are very unwilling to kind of fund organizations where they might not agree with the approach or just not with the personnel. So this is really a really big important thing kind of in the medium term, which is like depolarizing climate change. So and philanthropy is important here because philanthropy is what fueled civil society ultimately, right? So advocacy organizations need to be funded. That is kind of the medium term. I think in the short term, it's much more about making the most out of a moment and realizing that all different political coalitions have constructive things to contribute, right? So like what Bruce mentioned, the Trump administration in the first 4 months gave like license to 2 cultivated meat companies. They didn't do that because they care about climate change. They did this because they care about deregulation. And if you right now look at the US or in the European situation, similarly, like the main bottleneck to building clean energy faster is too much regulation, right? So they're very clearly things that you can do to advance climate goals that are not climate policy in the way that we usually think about it. And this is kind of where our focus is and should be going forward.
And you mentioned the word polarization, and I think that's something that we all struggle a lot with. And Bruce, you work in an industry that is extremely polarized, if I may say so, at least in the discussion in Germany where I follow it every once in a while. It's not only
which industry?
The food industry, I would say, specifically talking about meat. Maybe some of us know the discussion at their own dinner table, but we definitely do know it in a political landscape. We have quite a few politicians who have made it almost a cultural war, talking about what they eat and what they don't eat, and it's always a topic in election campaigns. How would you say can this discussion be depolarized and be talked more pragmatic? I mean, it is obvious to us that the way that we can produce alternative proteins is a huge point in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, all that kind of stuff. But it also needs to resonate with the public.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely have not felt like what we are doing is polarizing or polarized. And I think in large part that's because we are saying, yes, absolutely meat. Just like an electric vehicle is saying, yeah, of course you want your own car. Let's make it electric. And we're saying we can give you the exact same meat with, it requires significantly less land, it's cleaner, it's healthier. It's American entrepreneurship and innovation. It's small business. It's consumer choice. So we have, there's a protein innovation caucus, which is just focused on our work. And the founding members were 6 Democrats and 6 Republicans. So there's not no opposition. But the opposition, I mean, it's some Democrats and some Republicans who live in states with significant ranching or dairy communities. But there's also vigorous support because innovation is bipartisan, American ingenuity is bipartisan, consumer choice is bipartisan. So we're not saying change what you eat. It's not a part of any kind of food culture war. We're not saying go vegetarian or even eat less meat. We're saying let's make meat in a new and better way. And we're also saying, I mean, and there have been multiple editorials about this, which in the American context, and actually, I mean, Johannes mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. Do you see climate in that? The American Jobs Plan, you hear climate in that? 2 really massive climate bills framed in terms of the economy. And that helped those, I think, to advance, and we're intending to be sort of depolarizing. Here it's legitimately depolarizing, and we're able to point to what's happening in China, in Europe, and kind of around the world in terms of innovation here, and saying right now the US has multiple of the top companies on the plant-based side and the cultivated meat side. Do we want to give that up? So you can sort of appeal to people's patriotism as well. And we do have a lot of Republican allies, and we have passed multiple funding bills, all of which passed with overwhelming both Democratic and Republican support.
I think it's really interesting to hear you talk about this because I can see my German side being like, oh, I'm not sure if I agree, because you're being super pragmatic about an EV is just as much a good car as any other car or combustion car. But I know a lot of people are like, no, it doesn't make the same sound. It's not the same thing. I want this big motor. I want to burn something. So it seems like there is. There's this side of people who are super pragmatic and say, as long as it takes me where I want to go and it takes me there faster and cleaner, great, I'll take it. And as long as the meat tastes the same, I'm happy if it gives me the same protein and whatever I need. But there is also this side that just generally doesn't want change. So how do you deal with that?
Yeah, this is just the basic concept of like the early adopter and the late adopter. And our main, like, we think through socialization and familiarity, like as a species, we're not big fans of new things, and that's going to be even more true where food is concerned. So you need the early adopters and the socialization. EVs went from, in 2016, they hit 1%. And in 2024, they hit 22%. In China, they went from 1% in 2015 to 50% in 2024. That's pretty fast adoption, despite the fact that they haven't even really hit cost competitiveness yet. So that's the sort of thing that we're looking to for inspiration. And then we also, like, the modeling that has been done from the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, from McKinsey economists, for Climate Works Foundation and the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, like at 10% adoption, we're looking at 1.3 billion metric tons of mitigation. That's the equivalent of literally eliminating air travel. That's about the same as a 100% shift to electric vehicles. So it doesn't need to be all or nothing. Even 10% is a massive benefit. And as we socialize this, and suddenly, you've got 2 burgers in front of you or whatever it is that you're eating, and one of them has far less bacterial, it's like literally the exact same thing if it's cultivated meat, but one of them doesn't have bacterial contamination. If it's fish, it doesn't have mercury or dioxin or microplastics. Some people will be resistant, maybe a lot of people, but a lot of people will jump in, and as it becomes, as they're cost competitive and one of them is clearly healthier and safer, we think a shift is like not that steep of a challenge. I will say, like you're saying, how hard is this? And I'm saying there's a lot of enthusiasm and it's bipartisan. Not easy. So far in the history of the world, there has not been a plant-based meat that competed on price and taste. But we're optimistic. Like, we think science can do it. And we're meeting with enthusiasm from both conservative and liberal governments for the concepts. Although I will say, we're framing it not as a climate or biodiversity endeavor. We're framing it, for global health. Really, we're framing it for food security and economic benefits and choice and those sorts of things.
Johannes, I want to stick to this example because I think food is one of the great examples to talk about a lot of challenges. And I know some associations in Germany that try to work closely with farmers, because obviously farmers know firsthand how the climate is changing, but still they haven't really been allies in the whole climate movement. Quite the contrary, if we remember the protests that we had last year, where farmers went to Berlin and protested against the cut of subsidies for combustion cars. So how do you think, when we see this great innovation that's happening in the sector, how can we translate that into making new allies with the farmers? How do we bring them into the conversation so it's not a one against the other thing, which we're seeing at the moment, but it's we're all together, we have the same goal?
I'm not sure we will, and I'm not sure we have to. So I guess, like, to start with, right, like, farmers that see the impact of climate change are perfectly rational to not care about climate change, right? Because, like, even if they do everything, the climate change is not gonna change. So I think there's often this idea that people are acting against their interest, and if only we educate them, they're gonna see that it's actually in their interest, and it is actually not in anyone's interest to care about climate change. It's only in our global collective interest to care about climate change, but that's like a really important point. And I think the thing that's kind of undergoing this conversation is progress on climate does not come from everyone agreeing to care about climate. Nothing that we've achieved on climate has come from that, right? Solar getting cheap, wind getting cheap, electric cars getting cheap. None of these things have been achieved by lots of people agreeing that they care about climate change. They have been achieved by a couple of small jurisdictions agreeing that they like something for a particular reason, right? And in the case, I mentioned this before, in the case of solar, Germany being anti-nuclear and liking renewables, driving the cost of solar down. In the case of wind energy in the 1990s, Denmark, a similar story. Electric cars, again, very few jurisdictions. So I think we kind of know how we solve climate change. We need to generalize this approach towards more technologies. We haven't solved all of the problems, but I don't think we need to worry about bringing everyone on board for the same mission. And I think it's kind of the reason that I'm kind of pushing back here is because I think this matters, because I think like if you're assuming that this is the way to go and you're investing, and I think climate philanthropy has invested very much in kind of convincing people and like getting everyone kind of to endorse a certain framing of climate change, I think this has essentially produced this backlash that we're now seeing. So, yeah, obviously, right? Like there are things that farmers can do that you can bring them along, right? Like on adaptation, etc. But it's not. I don't think the way to win on climate change is make everyone a climate champion that calls himself a climate champion. Yeah.
I would like to stick with that for a second, because obviously it is my job to try and talk about climate change all the time and explain it to a broader audience and to the public. And so I find it interesting, because what I hear here is basically, let us do the whole climate thing and don't talk about it. And we don't have to take everybody on board. Is that what you're saying? Just challenging that a little bit more. Because sometimes it feels like we now have this, the government is also saying that kind of behind closed doors, where we talk to them, they're like, no, of course we're doing the new systems to heat Germany's homes, but we're just not telling anyone. So as a journalist, I'm like, not so sure if that's the best idea, but maybe it is. Maybe it's the faster way to say, we're going to change the whole heating system to heat pumps, but we're just not going to tell you about it so that you can't complain.
I think this is not quite what I'm saying. I mean, if you look at the heat pumps, I think the heat pump debate in Germany is a good example of spending political capital in a way that actually doesn't help climate very much, because it's actually not important how Germany heats. It's also not really important for the world whether Germany reduces heating emissions earlier or later, right? There's not really a fundamental innovation here. This is mostly, and it created a lot of political backlash, right? So this was a very bad way to spend political capital, because it was like very, very much predicated on the idea that everyone has to care about this, right? Like the idea was, okay, we're gonna replace heating with a more carbon neutral way, in a way that actually produces a lot of cost or complications for consumers, and it hasn't worked. And it's not how we achieve the progress, and it's not what Bruce is talking about. He wants to do with alternative proteins, and it's also not what Peter wants to make happen with decarbonization. It's not so much that no one should talk about it. It's more that we actually have enough attention to tackle climate change if we use the attention that we have in productive ways. So if we kind of focus, for example, on the hard to decarbonize sectors, if we drive the gaps that we still have, and there's more to be gained in allocating societal attention that is already there better than assuming that everyone will care about climate to the degree that kind of a certain group of people cares about it.
You've basically already passed it on to Peter, and I think I was already thinking about you all the time, because we've spoken about some sectors where we don't have the technologies yet, where we definitely need some more work to be done. So what's your perception of this discussion? Does it help you if people are talking about it more? How important is the whole education part? Or are you like, well, we're continuing our work even if there's no public opinion that supports us?
That for sure. But no, I had to think of one thing as Bruce was explaining. I thought, what a great situation if you have the potential to produce, to create a new product that has the same characteristics and you can bring additional benefits. So you don't have to care or you don't have to worry about, is the consumer in the mass market aware of climate impacts or not, because it's just a better choice. And it reminded me, as you were walking through it so much, of all the debates, and all of you know Germany is an auto country, is a car country, a lot of diesel lovers, especially if we look 10 years back or 5 years back when like EVs started getting stronger. I don't know how many discussions probably everybody had. And then you see, be it in your family or elsewhere, a person sitting in an EV for the first time and driving it, and they come back and you suddenly notice, hey, the narrative has changed. Oh, it's accelerating so fast, really? And you know, these kind of positive things. And if you convince, if you have the opportunity, and in some of the hard to abate sectors, we don't have that. It's tougher things. You know, it's not. We don't have rights law. We cannot drive down cost for hydrogen, green hydrogen, the same way we did with solar PV production or wind production. And that's where the tough part, I think, comes in. And as Johannes was talking from a bird's eye perspective about the strongest leverages, no, it's definitely not in the way in the last 10 or 20% or whatever the German population does on this thing or that. What matters is that the funding for basic research, for applied sciences, for all of these kind of things is set in a way it can really tackle problems and it's not misspent on topics like hydrogen for cars, for example. There's still funding programs for hydrogen for cars, which does not make sense, and it's just wasted euros or dollars or whatever that have become ultimately scarce in a world like this. And so looking at this, yes, we would continue anyways, but it's so much more effective if you can bring an advantage with a new solution in which is possible for ground mobility, trains, buses, cars. Now in the hard to abate sectors, it's so complex. That's the challenge. And Bruce was referring to the amount of carbon dioxide emissions that could be saved if 10% of, what was it, the world population moves to alternative proteins. True. However, flying comes with all these other climate effects, such as contrails, the non-CO2 emissions, NOx, and others, that also need to be taken into account. And then we're moving from this old energy world, basically, where it was a demand-following system, so large power stations, if we just take electricity, being adopted to the demand curve of the day, and we're moving into this new energy world now where there's thousands and millions in future of decentralized energy resources that need to, and demand needs to follow supply to some extent. We need more flexibility, we need to rethink, we need the green electricity suddenly for aviation fuels that we didn't need in future. We have to think about air capture, biogenic air capture, or direct air capture, and all these kind of mechanisms we need to combine. So yes, education, but in a sober way, never in a moral way, which is very important if you talk to both constituencies and policymakers, is so key. And you know, we're trying to use any channel we can get that's not preaching. To get the message across, like from, you know, that podcasts, TV shows, fact sheets, digital tools, to just get core messages that are sort of peer-reviewed across.
I think it's not a secret that it's best to make people believe it was their own idea if you want something to get done. So in this times where we see that priorities are shifting, and I mean, when I talk to company owners in those sectors, there's definitely just a sense of, I'll care about this later because right now there's not so much pressure in this field. Is that something that you see, and how do we bridge that now? Because we all know that time is a very decisive factor in this crisis.
Depends completely on the type of entrepreneur and size of the company. What we see, for example, which is also counter to the common belief, I think, that many right now have, everything's moving against climate action. If you look at SMEs, smaller and medium-sized enterprises, and family-run companies, and they've done a change 3 years ago in their thinking, they continue, they don't care. They don't look just for the next annual closing statements, the balance sheet or something, but they want to change, they want to become sustainable, they continue. regardless of the dialogue, at least in many cases. Of course, the larger groups, there have been shifts, especially, of course, with the investment plans of oil and gas majors or these kind of things, no doubt about it. You mean this type of postponing action? The worst thing that can happen, and the heat pump debate is again a great example where now all sides of the industry are complaining, is uncertainty. Is if you don't have some predictability in the legal framework, this just kills investment. Then, as we say in German, money gets shy, so people wait. And then, it's harder for startups, it's harder for scale-ups, it's harder for everybody in the whole value chain if you have uncertainty.
And, okay, you want to definitely go in there right now? Because I wanted to just challenge one point that Johannes said. The reasons why people do things and companies change is because for economic reasons, business reasons. That's basically what you said. Nobody does something because they care about the climate. When I hear you talking about these small and medium companies, I do hear a different narrative, that there is a sense of responsibility, of trying to be sustainable for the future. Would you say that can also be a driver for faster change? Or do you agree with Johannes in saying, let's put that part apart, that ideological, let's call it ideological framework, and just talk about the business?
Well, I think, generally, which includes aspects of biodiversity, includes aspects of circular economy. And so let's not put them all into the bucket of climate activism that's over-politicized, that's whatever. You didn't do that. But I'm just saying a lot of these objectives are good, and it's a lot of small steps that also drive some change. But I think what Johannes was talking about are the giant leaps that were taken, like in solar technology, in wind. But it's mainly, solar continues to be a revolution. Battery development continues to be a revolution. They keep beating expectations year by year for decades now. And it's just incredible. Like if we look at, I think just 2025 again, the cost reductions in production are just, breathtaking. And that's revolutionary changes, while a lot of small steps in small companies contribute to, say, the overall picture maybe.
Too bad that this change is now mainly driven by the Chinese more than by the Europeans. But I do want to take your point, Johannes. I think you were raising your hand while Peter was speaking.
Okay, yeah. I wanted to add something to my answer, but also I'm not quite sure I said I was trying to say what I think you... I'm not saying...
Never harms to repeat.
No, I think my point is not that no one cares about climate. I'm saying it is not an educational point for a farmer to care about climate. It's totally rational for a farmer to care about their subsidies and kind of act according to that, right? It's not that this idea that if everyone understands climate change and that climate change harms them, that then they will act in a good way. That is kind of not going anywhere. Obviously, climate, also the solutions are heavily driven by people that are very ideological. It's just smaller groups of people that are heavily committed to an idea. I think the other thing that I wanted to add is, so Peter was talking about people that are not preaching. So we're also really interested in supporting people that are preaching. So that's another way to kind of build momentum. So it's kind of having trusted messengers. So for example, we have one grantee. That's the Evangelical Environmental Network, right? So these are actually preachers. Because conservatives in the US, right, tend to trust, or some conservatives in the US kind of have a much better relationship to a faith-based environmental group than kind of the typical left of center hippie group that is kind of very different from them, right? So I think that's kind of an important part of building more support and also reducing uncertainty, because political change is inevitable. That's fundamentally the reason why depolarizing is important. You need to have some people on both sides caring about the issues.
And since you were talking about the US, I think Bruce wants to add.
Yeah, you had mentioned the idea that food is polarizing, and I think what Johannes said about climate also having been polarized. I think that part of that is sort of the finger pointing, you have to care about this, and if you don't care about this, you're a bad person. And then oftentimes, even worse than that, if you don't care about this, you don't actually understand what's good for you in sort of the farmer context. And I think one of the things that really works for alternative meats, occasionally, because we oftentimes have to start from we're not the people telling you to eat less meat or no meat. We think it's fine if you eat meat, and if you really love meat, then that's what we're here for, is to help make the meat better, healthier, less resource intensive, less expensive, et cetera. And I think the food movement is somewhat polarized because there have been the same sorts of people who are telling farmers that they know better than farmers what's good for them, have also been telling people you have to eat this, not that, or that, not this. And people, I think, very reasonably get their back up. And I think a big part of like shifting toward energy efficiency, shifting toward EVs, et cetera, is to make it more convenient, make it less expensive, make the cars drive faster. And with alternative proteins, a big part of it is to make it just as delicious, just as affordable, less expensive, and not come with guilt. So we do sometimes hear people say, oh, I'm a meat eater, that's not for me. And we have to say, well, we're not trying to create more options for vegetarians. We don't care what vegetarians eat. Like, if you're a meat eater, then this is absolutely for you. And that also can sometimes be a little bit of a laugh line too. So sort of resonating with people.
I think I want to just stick with the polarization topic for 1 second, Johannes. We've seen, I think we all agree that there is a certain polarization and that it needs to be depolarized and that we need a pragmatic approach and that we all want just people to do it for good arguments and just to choose that option. Where do you believe that polarization comes from? Maybe that's important to understand if we want to depolarize it, because I feel like both sides are like, but the other ones are the ones polarizing. If you look at the left, they're like, well, every time we suggest something that is pragmatic, like cutting subsidies for climate unfriendly things like combustion cars or stuff like that, then they are being called ideological. Whereas that is actually a very conservative measure, like cut subsidies. I think that is nothing that conservatives generally would say, no, thank you. And then the other side, the center and right, they're saying, well, the left have made it such a polarized topic, they've made it into a culture war. Where do you believe, does it come from? Are there any studies about it, and how can we tackle it?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg problem. I think where it comes from is essentially different factions engaging with each other over a long time. So it's kind of not easy to fix, right? It's not that, I mean, a lot of early environmentalism happened in the Nixon era by conservative presidents. In the United States.
Yeah, we also have a pope who Francis cared a lot about the climate. There were, in a lot of African countries, I know that it's mainly Catholic groups that drive climate protection.
Yeah, so I think it's, and I mean, obviously it's also different in different places, but I think it's certainly a reaction to essentially climate in particular becoming very related to certain beliefs about protecting the world in a very moralizing manner, right? So like all of us here are a little bit like outcasts in the climate conversation, because like the typical environmentalist, if you ask them how do you solve climate change, they will not say innovation, and if they will kind of have, oh no, we should do this in a particular moral way, right? And like that is, if you repeat these kind of ideological framings for a long time, that's what you're gonna get. And yeah, but I think fundamentally it's fixing it is kind of, it's not possible to build a time machine. So in that sense, fixing it has to kind of come from building civil society on both sides of the aisle, and also not really, I think, aiming for everyone framing climate the same. I think accepting that different political traditions have different things to contribute to solving the problem.
And I feel like that's Peter's keyword, because I know that he wants to build bridges.
I definitely like to come in on the point of talking in a certain way, moral way about something for too long, and I'd like to come back to the preachers, because the cool thing about these preachers is it's a surgical step, and you expect them to preach because they're preachers. But if you're in the NGO community, and I've been attending a lot of these climate summits, so COPs and SB sessions, the preparatory meetings, and it's always just campaigning and pointing the finger for so long. That just doesn't work. I mean, how can you possibly imagine to win a majority in such a usually diverse type of population, constituencies set up of such diverse population groups, and policymakers or politicians seeking re-election, all these kinds of other issues that are being negotiated in parallel at the same time, all the time. This approach, I think, can only fail. And if you then see that when talking about solutions, some of these groups are really like in ivory towers. They live so detached from the solutions. So you check back and say, okay, yeah, you want to electrify that industrial process. So that's 1,800 degrees. How are you going to do it? Oh, yeah, we're just going to use hydrogen. Okay, so where are you going to get the hydrogen from? Yeah, it's going to be green. Yeah, but so how expensive do you think it's going to be? Like 1 kilogram, how much? Oh yeah, it's going to get cheaper. Yeah. So, and it's even if you reach that level, and this has been going on for so long, and this leads to this. Of course, they're being put into a certain into a certain bucket and automatically, or into a drawer, and it's like, oh yeah, it's those activists again, and that does not harm. That does not help the debate, I think. So preaching is great if you're a preacher, but for the others, it's good, adopting the tone, not blaming, trying to find a solution.
But it does seem to be true that people like to have figures that they can look up to. I mean, the climate movement on the left has figures like Greta Thunberg, or here in Germany, Luisa Neubauer. We have people like that. And I asked several AI models what could be those figures on a more center and right side, and they gave me people like Arnold Schwarzenegger, Ursula von der Leyen, the Pope Francis, and I actually thought, well, that's not that little to start with. There are some people, but it seems like they don't get the same resonation with the. Maybe Johannes maybe you have a thought on that. How important is that, or can we neglect that as well? Because I feel like these people are then less pushed. The left climate movement has a certain sense of liking the idea of purity. They want people to be perfect. And then the right then turns into this sort of Trump way of just neglecting it completely. So where can you find middle ground for people to also have sort of role models? I mean, maybe Johannes, also Bruce, if you're probably watching this in the US. Whoever wants to start.
I mean, I think I'm back to, I love the line, they're preachers, you expect them to preach. That was hilarious. I think a lot of this can happen with a reframing. So it's definitely helpful to have people who care about climate, because all of the companies and all of the innovation, those people chose these innovations because of concern for climate or biodiversity, or in the case of alternative proteins, it could be animal welfare, it could be global health. So we do need people who care about climate, but to the degree it's focused on individual action, like, that's really hard to scale. That's not where the solution is. So I do think to a significant degree, if we can frame the solutions in terms of innovation, in terms of economics, with a shift, like China, a big part of their shift to renewables is the massive amount of oil that they were importing, and nobody wants to be energy dependent. That was the early work under Nixon, and solar and alternative energies was completely focused. Came right after the OPEC scare, raising prices, the embargo. And I think almost everything that we're working on can probably be reframed. Certainly, for GFI, we're reframing it in terms of, food self-sufficiency, food security, tighter supply chains, less likelihood of bioterrorism, economic benefits, choice, et cetera. So I really do resonate with, one of the things I think that Johannes has said a few times, that we can, I think, depolarize it by even moving it somewhat off of climate and framing it in terms of the benefits that are obvious for people, rather than saying you're a bad person if you don't care about this issue.
Did you want to add, or?
I think one thing I would add is that it's kind of interesting that people were so excited about Greta Thunberg, right? And I have the strong hypothesis that if they were a conservative person like her, they would not get the media attraction that they do get, right? So like you could kind of feel like in most of the reporting on Greta Thunberg, that like most of the mainstream press was kind of very excited about her, right? Like, so I don't want to sound like a conservative conspiracy theorist, but I mean, media bias plays a role here, right? In the sense that that most journalists, and certainly most journalists kind of covering the climate beat, are excited about a young left-leaning protester and are kind of willing to amplify her. And if she had, just go through this in your head, if she had been like a male, strongly religious person, right of center, I think they would never, like, I don't know who's kind of interested in environmentalism for other reasons, they would never have gotten that traction, right? So there's again a reinforcing loop there.
When it comes to the media, I would say the more extreme the demands are, the more attention it gets. So since a conservative approach to climate change is more like, okay, look, we don't have to change everything, but we can actually tackle this crisis, that just resonates less because it's less extreme. So I'm not 100% sure, I don't agree 100% if it's really the bias or if it's more the stronger the statement, the more resonance you'll get from the media. But from all of what I've heard today, I think there's just one question left for me. I'm preparing the audience. Please think about your questions. We're going to open it for the questions very soon. I think all of this works really well in establishing a second business lane and more economy. So if we look at Texas, it's now one of the biggest contributors to renewable energies, but it doesn't really work when it comes to reducing CO2 emissions. So Texas is still emitting more and more CO2 and extracting more and more oil and gas. And since we have this time problem when it comes to the climate crisis, how do we bridge that? Because, okay, it's great if we have alternatives and we have extra energy, and at least the added energy is now green, but we also know that we need to reduce the other stuff, and we need to reduce that fast. Peter, do you have an idea on how to get there?
Yes, I think, if you look at it from, again, such a high-level view, like a global view, it's super important to look at those future emissions that could be either avoided or even in a worst case be locked into old infrastructure. So rising emissions in Asia and Africa in particular, rapidly rising. That's one of the largest leverages because of course, regulation is important, and ultimately we need to reduce any emissions or at least come to a net zero scenario. It's not the year 2050 sharp, but it depends on the industry, and we must avoid targeting this one date, and after this everything collapses. No. No dystopian scenarios here, but it's important to keep the pressure in the system. So yes, we need to drive down all the emissions, but in particular we need to see what kind of technologies, what kind of scaling and innovation steps we can take to avoid as many of those emissions that will certainly come, because these regions have any right and every right to develop and build up civilization infrastructure, because this makes such. If we look at our leverage from now, because that's all that counts, I wouldn't just boil it down to how can we reduce the rest, but how can we, of course, reduce the rest proportionately and while maintaining some consensus, but in particular innovate. So those large-scale investments that are about to be taken and infrastructure that's about to be put into place, from everything from cement to, how we fly, how we travel or transport goods via the oceans, can be made not green, but sustainable fast.
Of course, innovators like to think about the future, but we are seeing climate change actually at a pace that is much more than most scientists' thoughts. So I want to try and pull it back to the now. Maybe Johannes, you have an idea what sort of, because I think the idea of innovation and technology going to to reduce future emissions is amazing, and a lot of conservatives can easily resonate with that. But can they also resonate with a change of lifestyle that we might need to reduce emissions now to bridge that gap that we need if we want to talk about tipping points, if we want to talk about tackling the climate crisis right now?
I think one lesson from the last couple of years is, right, if you kind of think about climate attention over the last 10 years, it's kind of going up after 2015, after the Paris Agreement and Greta Thunberg in 2018, 2021. And now it's certainly gone down. And I think it's kind of clear that, like, even in the best of times, there was no climate policy that was successful, that was kind of strongly predicated on the idea that the majority of people would actually want to change their lifestyle. So this hasn't worked in the time where we had the most attention to climate that we've seen, and maybe that we'll ever get. So yeah, I would kind of say I would not focus on this, and I would kind of try to maybe draw out what Peter's saying a little bit more, because I think it's kind of really important and really underappreciated fact about the climate challenge. So the thing that I'm upset about with Texas is not that they still have some fossil fuels, or if we look back in 2050 and like how had Texas kind of make climate change bad. Texas would be in a great place, for example, to innovate on advanced geothermal, because they have a lot of drilling, and the next generation geothermal uses drilling technology. And this is the major play with which Texas will make a difference to global emissions. And the reason for that is that even the United States is something like 10% of future emissions in the rest of the century at most, right? So it's kind of easy to judge Texas by when they will retire their coal plants, or in Germany to kind of do the heating law, which kind of creates a lot of political backlash. But it's not really in the global emission math picture. It's not really relevant, and like it's also not true. I think sometimes it's kind of easy to say like new technologies will avoid emissions in the future. I think new technologies have already avoided massive amounts of emissions by infrastructure not getting built, right? So like climate forecasts have gone so much better. I think it's kind of easy to overlook this, but if you go back 15 years, people would expect something like 3.5 degrees of warming. Now the forecast is like 2.5 degrees of warming. And like 80% of that change is like solar and wind and electric cars, right? So this is not, obviously those emissions, like you don't see the infrastructure not being built, but it's not that we're all betting on fusion and solving the problem with innovation. It's like, in fact, we're saying the thing that has solved most of the problem to date is also the best candidate for solving the rest of the problem. And if there are some severe tipping points in 2030, then I guess we're screwed is the technical term. But that's we're not going to get there as a political strategy to massively reduce emissions in the short term. And yeah.
And I think everything that you just said, Johannes, I resonate with in the energy context. And I want to move it over to the food context, because in 2006, the UN Food and Agriculture Organization said that one of the top causes of climate change is animal agriculture. They said it's 14.5% of all climate emissions in 2006 were attributable to animal agriculture. They put a whole bunch of potential mitigation options into that document. They're the exact same livestock mitigation options that are being discussed now, almost 20 years later. They've done some good, but not very much, because there's not an economic incentive for any of them. So some people here, if you're following, you'll read about methane mitigation through changing the feed, or by adding seaweed, or various other methane mitigation interventions. The best case from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, says the most that we could hope for from all of those interventions combined are 200 megatons of mitigation. It's better than not 200 megatons of mitigation, metric tons of mitigation, but it's nowhere. We're going to have 1.3 billion more gigatons of ruminant methane in 2050, because they're going to be more. So do you want 1.3 or 1.1? with those mitigation interventions. And then the other intervention from 2006 was telling people not to eat meat or to eat less meat, which is sort of analogizes to people need to make changes for the climate now. I'm sure some people did. It'd probably be even worse if not for that messaging. But we are 40% up, 104 million metric tons more meat today, 370 instead of 266, than we were when they did that calculation. And now the World Bank says that a fifth of climate emissions are attributable to animal agriculture before you even consider the massive land use needs. So we really do need the innovation because it's just going to keep going up. The scientific consensus is that if meat were to stay even, climate goals would be impossible. But it's not going to stay even; it's going to go up, which means climate, biodiversity, forestation goals are all going to be impossible. And so far, most of the climate community continues to be, let's feed cattle seaweed, let's look at changing the rumens, the digestion of ruminants, and let's encourage people to eat less or no meat, even though those have not scaled. So maybe we should probably keep doing those things, but we really do need the innovation. We need alternative proteins, alternative meats. It's the one thing that has worked in energy, as Johannes said, is not don't consume, but make the consumption less, mitigate the emissions of the consumption. We need that as well in agriculture, or climate goals are going to be completely impossible.
That's a strong statement. I definitely want to open up for questions. I mean, I have a lot of questions here, but just raise your hand. I'll look around and, okay, there's the first one already. Please. That's a very interesting question. Who wants to tackle it? I feel like...
I could go for the energy sector because you mentioned fracking. Indeed, fracking turned the energy world around. I mean, making the US from a net importer to the largest fossil fuels producer, basically, and now leading to Michael Liebreich calling the US the world's petrostate and China the world's electrostate. I think that hopefully our discussion has not led in the general impression that any regulation on this and any approaches to put this into, give it guardrails, is bad leftist, agitating, moralist policies. Not at all. We need all these, a lot of policies on this. And still I'd like, I mean, if you look at it in a way that, say there were to come a next super cheap innovation for fossil fuels, I cannot see it bring, if I could stay in this energy field for a second, I could not see it bring, luckily, and thanks to all the development, the big leverage that the solar revolution has brought. And I'd like to add one figure on this, if I may, because it fully seconds Johannes' case from 10 minutes ago or so. Let's look at a country that is not known for ambitious climate policy at all, or for adopting clean tech rapidly. Let's look at Pakistan. Pakistan, in 2024, has imported and installed the equivalent of, depending on which source you take, 17 to 22 gigawatt of solar PV. Now, a gigawatt, just to give you an idea, gigawatt is the nameplate capacity of a nuclear power plant. If solar PV doesn't run all the time, there's this capacity factor discussion, okay, but it still shows how powerful an innovation that drives a technology to such super cheap levels can be. And until April 25 of this year, they installed another 10 gigawatt, which is just massive. And it's just the pure force of this innovative, clean, modular, easy to install. It's ready for behind the meter. A lot of these developments, the grid operators don't even measure anymore. They can't, because people are just installing it and charging batteries and using it behind their Stromzähler, their meter. I think, yes, these things can be up, and at some extent they must be regulated then, of course. If something toxic, if something completely against the public interest comes up, I hope there will remain a consensus to regulate it in most jurisdictions. even if there's other voices at the moment that say, okay, let's free all that up to innovation. Of course, that's not possible. But generally, the power is just so strong of innovation, making Johannes' case.
And I mean, in the realm of producing meat, this is a good time to sort of take a step back and point out that the basic physiology of cycling crops through animals is so vastly inefficient that even if the labor were free, it would still, once it scales up, vastly undercut the prices of producing meat in the current way. The most efficient industrial farms, it takes 9 calories fed to a chicken to get 1 calorie back out. So most people here are probably concerned about food waste. This is literally 800% food waste. You produce 9 calories for every 1 calorie of chicken you consume. Farmed fish is a little worse. Pork is a little worse than that. Beef is a lot worse than that. And it's not just the inefficiency. You're growing those crops. You're shipping those crops to the feed mill. You're operating the feed mill. You're shipping the feed to the farm. You're operating the farm. You're shipping the animals to the slaughterhouse. You're operating the slaughterhouse. That's why the climate benefits of the shift are so great, because of the massive efficiency gains of figuring out how to make meat, biomimic the precise experience, make plants biomimic the precise experience of meat, or in cultivated meat, grow the meat directly. And what that means is, but the economic opportunity here really does mirror things like solar and wind and EV batteries. You mentioned Wright's law earlier. For every doubling of solar capacity, the price of solar falls by about 12%, which means every 3 years we're doubling solar capacity. That can also happen with alternative proteins. It can't happen with the current system.
I really like your question because it also challenges something that Johannes said. You were saying that example of the drilling will be important for geothermal revolution. So I think there is a fear, and maybe that's a little bit where your question comes from, that we will have these problems solved by the same companies that actually brought us into this situation. There's this narrative of saying, like, how can we trust people that have been not caring about the climate and destroying, if intentionally or not, that's hard to tell, but have been destroying the planet or using it for their benefit. And now we are supposed to trust them to solve the crisis. And I think that's a little bit, when we talk about innovation can solve all these things, there is a certain fear that they also might go into a direction that doesn't. If you say it's not for the climate sakes that we're doing it, but just for business reasons, if there is an innovation that comes up and it's just more valuable in the food sector, that might not be the case. But you were saying there might be other examples that we don't know about. How do we convince people to choose the climate-friendly path if they don't really care about that?
So of course, someone like, right, we care about, when we set innovation policy, we set this by things that we care about, right? So like in a way, I feel like this is a misunderstanding. Like, we're not making an argument, or I think none of us here makes an argument for, let's just do all of the innovation for all of technologies indiscriminately, right? We're talking about targeted investments in socially beneficial technologies, right? So I don't know. The concern raised about we might get negative technologies that we don't want would, I think, apply much more if we would say something like, okay, we just give a tax credit to all kinds of innovation activity, independent of which technology we're talking about. But this is not a point that any of us would advance, I think.
Thank you. Is that your question has been answered? Okay, then we can go on here. Bruce, I think that's essentially what you're trying to do when you try to convince meat eaters.
We're not. I mean, we're not trying to convince meat eaters. We think that just like with EVs, the IEA in 2015, the International Energy Agency in 2015, their report on electric vehicles said they're never going to have any meaningful impact on climate. They're never going to have any meaningful penetration of the car market. And they said the reason for that is battery range. They only go 100 kilometers. We're not going to convince people that they only want to go 100 kilometers. There's not a charging infrastructure, and they cost too much. And they were right about those three things being non-negotiable The problem was they couldn't imagine a world in which innovation solved those three things. The reason EVs are shooting up the curve and have shot up the curve is that the world put in a, Europe, China, and the US put in a charging infrastructure, solved battery range, and brought the price of the cars down. Very similar analysis, the next year in 2016, IEA's prediction for 2040 about solar penetration was surpassed in 8 years, not 34 years. And that's because the price of solar went down and the grid got better. We can do that with alternative proteins. Like 100% of the polls about plant-based meat and cultivated meat, on the plant-based side, people don't like the taste and it costs too much. We can solve that. On cultivated meat, doesn't really exist meaningfully yet, but people are very enthusiastic about it. Like consumer polling is very positive if we can get it to price parity, and we can. And if you model what it looks like to get to net zero, if you model what it looks like to get to 2.0, when we think about whatever your issue is, here we're talking in terms of climate change, we want to figure out what's going to have the biggest impact, what has the highest tractability. Those are kind of the things that we want to focus on to have the maximum emissions reduction. And my hypothesis would be that there's still ample work to be done in the hard-to-abate sectors that's focused on the technology, in food that's focused on technology, and then really leaning in on renewables and making sure that the gains that we have gotten so far continue. And I would be very surprised if effort put on personal change, which simply doesn't scale globally. Like even if you can get all of Germany or all of Denmark or all of some other European country, which is really the only place in the world where there's a lot of care about climate change, if you can get everybody to change fundamentally, the emissions reduction is not going to be that great. But we can make the targets if we solve agriculture, if we electrify everything, and if we make some progress in the hard-to-abate sectors. I do think it's tech.
Do you agree, Peter? Because
I'm afraid yes. I understand. It's a very good question and a very good comment. I think various jurisdictions and various audiences and populations work differently or accept narratives differently depending on the background and the role innovation has traditionally played, for example. None of this, of course, happens in isolation. Everything needs to be embedded in laws, in regulations, in funding programs, all these kind of things. But if we just look at let's take one extreme, the US, United States, super innovation heavy, but also environmental movement, roots country. So like they were the innovators, Silent Spring, Rachel Carson, all this kind of 60s publications on the environmental movement, and that as well. And any approach on the climate that took, by any administration that took a behaviorist note or behaviorist approach failed. Carter was the worst one. Carter was sitting in the White House, heating turned down, with a big coat, and of course didn't get reelected because nobody liked the story. When George W. Bush, after Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005 or so, had to ask, because there were shortages of supply of gasoline, had to ask people in a TV address, okay, we're asking you to maybe during the next couple of days not use so much gasoline. There was a comedian, a late night show, Jon Stewart, I think is his name. He played the excerpt, just this sentence by George W. Bush, and then the camera got back to him and he said, "The apocalypse is upon us." Like this guy asking us to use less energy, it just doesn't work I think in the US, this approach. And it works way better in Germany because there's a different turn of the environmental movement. There's a different self-concept, I think, of Germans and adapting to it. But even if they all wanted, just as Bruce said, even if we all tried the best we did, it wouldn't be sufficient because we need to build bridges and roads. We need to build heavy infrastructure. We need a lot of concrete at the moment, and all the cement is causing so much emissions that if we don't find smart systems soon to build way more efficiently and with alternative cementitious materials and all these kind of things, it's just going to be super hard, or I'm afraid it's going to be impossible.
It's interesting that you use that example because it's exactly what happened when Robert Habeck asked during the energy and gas crisis in Germany. He asked people to reduce their consumption, and that's exactly what the Germans did. They reduced their consumption massively, so that actually did help a lot. So maybe to give everybody the chance to answer to your question, that change of behavior, at least in some points, in these. I don't know if you want to add to your question, so Johannes can get the chance to maybe get some of his insights.
Yeah, not much to add. I think the one thing I would add is that climate targets are not real, right? So it's not that there's one amount of emissions we're going to be okay and another one where everything is going to go bad. So in that sense, like when someone makes an argument of the form, we need behavioral change to meet X and Y emission target, that is not a good justification to focus on behavioral change. The good motivation to focus on behavioral change would be focusing on behavioral change gets us the most emission reduction for a given amount of effort. And I think that is kind of the thing where I think one can be extremely skeptical about whether this will always ever be the case. And in particular, because the rest of the world is like we're not all Germany. Like the world is not full of like rich Europeans who actually can massively change their consumption behaviors. That's like actually a very untypical situation.
Yeah, it seems like a first world problem if you can only shower 5 minutes instead of 10. But we have another question here. Thank you very much. Thank you for your insights as well. Very good question. Let's talk about fashion. No, but definitely 100%. Johannes, what do you think? Is that something that is worth, because you're always talking about where should we put our energy into? Is that something that we need to tackle?
Overconsumption or?
Yeah, that's overconsumption, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, it helps to reduce consumption, but I guess I would kind of say the same thing I just said. But like the idea that overconsumption is a big part of the problem rests on the idea that the world is very similar to where we are, which by and large it is not. So whether or not you reduce overconsumption, you need to create the situation where you can buy the phone every 6 months. That doesn't mean buying the phone every 6 months is a reasonable thing to do, but you essentially need to solve for the situation where additional consumption has no or negligible environmental consequences because of the global emission math, right? So because where future emissions and future consumers are. I'm not sure that's whether.
I think.
You wanted to add because
maybe just adding to Johannes. I think the general undertone also of this discussion, at least as I've perceived it, should not be, hey, technology will save everything, like technology will save us all. It's always a mix of also what your question was pointing to, regulation, doing smart things that benefit the community, of course, in terms of the guardrails one sets or a jurisdiction sets, but develop certain key technologies such as alternative proteins, such as way more efficient ways to build buildings and heavy infrastructure of any kind, and ways to achieve mobility. And if you look at strongly developing regions or parts of the world, let's just take India. I think the record order for jets, 2024 and 2023, some of the record orders to Airbus and Boeing and all these producers came from India, because there's a massively growing middle class that wants to travel. We just had an event on this last week. 80% of the world have never boarded a plane. And it's not up to us, I'm with Johannes there, us in the sort of developed world, rich, very rich world, to tell them, flying is not such a good idea because we need to reduce emissions. So that's also something, if you take circular economy, biodiversity, and climate change, that I've occasionally come across in discussions or on panels, that there was somebody who was advocating for biodiversity, and either the moderator or somebody from the audience, you have not done this, but try to, okay, we either have to decide biodiversity or climate change. No, it goes hand in hand. A lot of the innovations we work on in construction, for example, rest on circular approaches, reusing building blocks to build other buildings with them in future, and not have them made out of limestone and cement in the first place. So that's, I think these are parts of a puzzle that somehow need to go together.
So circularity would be the answer, because basically, Johannes, I understood your answer that that's something we don't have to worry about too much because there's not many people who can afford overconsumption, because you said this is the position we take, and you're saying, well, there's a growing class that wants more and more consumption too, but we can solve that with circularity. Or did I get you wrong when you were answering?
More like, because no, my point is more like Western overconsumption is a small part of future emissions or future material flows, whatever you care about, right? You need to get into a situation where you're essentially multiplying with zero so that the amount doesn't matter.
And I also just want to say, like, I assume everybody in this room, the reason you're here is that you care about climate change. And I assume that everybody who is here, because you care about climate change, you are making personal decisions that lower your climate footprint. Those things are good. We should encourage those things. But if you're here because you got invited by Founders Pledge or Effektiv Spenden, you're also thinking, what is the thing that effort over mitigation has the highest value? And so it's worth looking at where are the emissions and what is the tractability of those emissions reductions. And that's where I think you come up with all of sort of the top interventions are going to be things that can scale globally. And really that's going to be tech-based, science-based interventions.
You've basically already built a bridge to the closing statements. I want to take in one more question over there. I hope we still have the time. But
very good question. Just repeating it in case somebody's not heard it. What can we do, first of all, for the PV, for the energy, for electricity production? How can we replicate the success that's been taking place in China, which was due to billions of capex investment, capital expenditures, correct? Yes, great. So I will start, and then it's over to you. I think the story starts a little earlier, because hadn't it been for the 1,000 Roofs program and a lot of other initiatives in Japan and Texas, and in particular for the Erneuerbare Energiengesetz, the feed-in tariff in Germany, that probably most of you, if you were, most were alive in the early 2000s. So that,
bold assumption.
No. Look, all of you have paid for with your electricity bills. All of you had this EEG surcharge with your electricity. Now, was that the smartest approach for Germany to drive down its carbon dioxide emissions? No, for sure not. They should have replaced coal power plants by gas power plants, for example, or taken a whole lot of other measures. But by having this program and so dedicatedly, to what extent they were fully knowledgeable of the effect they would have, I don't know. But it was such an effective step. If you look at the mid-2000s, 2000, I think 5, 6, 7, or 4, 5, 6, up to 60%, sometimes 70% of the PV capacity installed globally was installed in Germany with lousy weather that we usually have, at least in the northern half. What this led to was, of course, and you know that probably you're from the industry, but it led to a cost decline already. It led to economies of scale. And then came the Chinese with these brilliant microloan programs and a lot of other programs and support. And if they know something, it's like way too summarizing and making this too simple here. But if smart, dedicated Chinese industrial policy has proven something since the mid-2000s, and that was a long-term, decade-long plan, was to drive down cost and to scale and achieve economies of scale and create an environment that can innovate effectively. Also, not just the moonshot projects, but also this incremental innovation. So that has happened, and by far the strongest clean tech production capacities on any given clean techs. Heat pumps are a little exception, are in China. it will be hard to replicate that. But if we want to take one lesson, sorry, I'm almost done with my answer. If we want to take one lesson, and if we compare, that's another of these biases. You think, oh, the Chinese produce their batteries so cheap because labor is so cheap in China. No. If you compare American and Chinese battery production, cost per watt of storage capacity is way lower in China because of the automation, because it's automated production. The share of labor, of hours put into each battery system is higher in the United States. So it's automation, it's a very ambitious long-term policy, and it's knowing how to scale things. It's the scaling business. Bruce?
Yeah, I mean, alternative proteins is also a scaling business. I mean, that is obviously how solar became cheap. That's how EVs, batteries became cheap. In both cases, China was dispositively responsible for those costs coming down because China just really does manufacture things better than any place in the history of the world. With alternative proteins, if you look at what's required for wind infrastructure or solar infrastructure, they require about 10 times as much land per unit of energy. Whereas if you're looking at alternative proteins, you're looking at, if it's plant-based or cultivated chicken, about a sixth the land. If it's beef, it's about a 20th the land. So we have sort of the opposite thing going on. We require less land rather than more land. We also, if you're looking at like EV batteries, they need cobalt from the Congo, they need lithium from Uyghur areas of China, as well as Afghanistan. Like there are none of those sort of crazy inputs for alternative proteins. One EV battery factory costs, in the US at least, on the order of $3 to $5 billion for one EV battery factory. The alternative protein shift, because it doesn't require all the extra stages of production that I laid out earlier, it actually decreases the amount of infrastructure needed to produce meat rather than increasing the amount of infrastructure needed. So we do think that, you look at China, and we do put a lot of hope in China. They went from, in the early 2000s, being a net food exporter to now their food self-sufficiency is at about 60%, so from more than 100% to 60%. And they're super concerned about that. Famine is still very much in the memories of a lot of the Chinese leadership. So they are recognizing the value of making meat from plants, cultivating meat from cells, and they're leaning in, and we're encouraging of that. But we do think it's also in the interest of other countries that have food self-sufficiency issues, like Japan and Korea and Singapore and Israel. It's also in the interests of big agricultural nations like Brazil and the United States and Canada and Australia. So the framing's a little bit different. But we think any of these governments, for purely self-interested reasons, could really get us toward and shooting up the S-curve. And the only two questions we ask, I mentioned all the places that GFI exists now, we're about 235 staff, plurality scientists. The only two questions we ask is, do they have robust scientific ecosystems, and does their government fund a lot of science? Because we think a global approach focused on those countries is the way to get to the S-curve and shoot up it as soon as possible.
Thank you very much. I'm going to do a short closing round, because we want to have time to get a drink and maybe continue this discussion downstairs. Actually, just for everybody to know, you go down on the left and you'll find some drinks to discuss over. And I mean, I love how you basically answered that question with saying that it was a German law and regulation that helped this incredible revolution in the solar industry. For the closing remarks, let's take it back to the question that we started this, saving what can still be saved in this new political landscape. What do you think needs to be done now from your perspective? 2 sentences, because it's the last thing that we do before we can go downstairs.
I start. Well, for the general question of this panel, I think the most important part is stability in the guardrails, in the regulations. So it's a marathon, not a sprint. And climate change will come back to the agenda. I have no doubt, unfortunately, because extreme weather events will push it back up everywhere. And then it's really focusing on the most surgical steps that help the most neglected or highest leverage sectors with a particular view to the developing world.
I think I want to add to this because my question was also aimed at philanthropy and thinking what donors should be thinking about right now. So you think they should be lobbying for those guardrails? That is what you think people should be focusing on?
Well, for donors, depending on which pathway they take, the first thing is zoom out of Germany. So because we can have a situation where we have a completely decarbonized Germany by 2050 and still will surpass 4 or 5 degrees, because this will not decide it. And then it's really, maybe it sounds strange to say that because we're an advocacy organization, but supporting some of the strongest advocacy organizations and not always go for the mainstream of environmental protection that's there.
There's no harm in self-advertising. Bruce.
I think one is we need solutions that scale. So we need solutions that have economic incentives. That's the lesson of solar and wind and EVs, I think. And then the second is it's not going to happen without agriculture. Super honored and delighted to be here sharing the day as talking about climate change solutions and talking about agriculture, because the vast majority of the climate change conversation is focused exclusively on energy and decarbonization in that context. And all of the modeling indicates that if meat consumption keeps going up, I agree with Johannes that it's not about these precise climate goals, but it does mean that climate emissions are just going to keep going up unless we solve it. And so far, the only tractable solution that we seem to have is giving people the meat, dairy, and eggs that they love, but produced without the same climate and land use needs.
Do you see a political challenge in the shifting of the political landscape that people need to tackle and take into consideration?
It seems like in most of the world, this can be framed as an economic innovation and food security intervention. GFI Europe and GFI US are spending a lot of time thinking about inroads with farmers. So GFI Europe contracted with Green Alliance to produce a report which modeled low and high alternative protein interventions and what do you do with all of the freed up land. And even if you hold exports steady, they looked at 10 European countries and they said if you hold exports steady and you take a third of that land, can get those 10 countries to food self-sufficiency, so not exporting anymore, producing for domestic consumption. You can take a third of the land and shift toward regenerative and agroecological practices, so still farming animals, but doing it in a far more responsible way. You can 4x the amount of agroecology and regenerative agriculture, and then you take a third of the land and you can rewild that land and shift to ecosystem services, and you can pay farmers even more for ecosystem services than they were making from farming. And you also save those countries a bunch of money because they were otherwise going to have to pay for tech-based sequestration. So these sorts of political solutions that can bring everybody with us are the sorts of things that I think we need to be thinking about and leaning in on.
And you're painting this beautiful picture of happy animals everywhere. Johannes, you have the last word.
Okay, so the 2-sentence version. I think the first sentence would be making the most out of the current moment, and that means supporting all of the climate and clean energy solutions which are favorable in current political environment, right? So this can be, if you're thinking about the American context, this can be geothermal or nuclear. Now is a good moment to drive innovation in those because the Trump administration is excited about them and they would help a lot with climate. The second one I think would be don't let a crisis go to waste. So like learn the lesson of learned the lesson of that a big part of the problem is having invested so heavily philanthropically and otherwise in just one part of the political equation. So really scaling kind of and also, sorry, this is a long second sentence. Not building on solutions that assume that everything will be great or that public support for climate action will be amazing. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much for this fruitful discussion, and I'm looking forward to taking it downstairs and continuing there. Thank you also for your patience and engagement.